Hey everyone, how's it going? Juan Dhas here, and welcome to this week's lesson video. And I wanted to talk specifically about harmony because I was just thinking about what I could do for this week's lesson, and something about developing, or rather expanding, a chord vocabulary using a lot of existing stuff that you might already have together. It seemed like a great idea. And especially because I wanted to approach this from the perspective of opening up different possibilities with chords, especially when it comes to trio playing. Because sometimes I think we can still get locked into certain shapes and thinking that, okay, this chord goes with this sound. How can we further expand that to maybe open up the fretboard a little more and give us some freedom to explore more colors and more sounds and more ideas? And this is especially good for trio and solo playing, where maybe you want to explore some different ideas and you have a little more freedom to. As always, if you do like what I'm doing here on the channel, please do like and subscribe. It actually helps me out a lot, and also gives me an idea of what you guys want to see if you leave stuff in the comments. So let's get into the lesson. Now, one thing I always tell students to explore after they've really started expanding and their existing vocabulary with drop twos, drop threes, and triads, and some intervallic shapes, is to start exploring ideas against different roots. And this already gives a hint as to why I suggest this is really good for trio playing. So, for example, let's take this shape that I opened the little improv piece with. You can think of it like a sus2 voicing off B flat. So I've got B flat, C, and F. And what I do is really quite simple. I put all 12 roots, or all 12 notes, against that chord shape. And what you'll find is you start amassing a different vocabulary of chords, and this shape suddenly doesn't exist in one area. Sometimes I think we as guitar players, as I said, can stick to a shape as in, oh, that's a B flat sus2, it's always going to be a B flat sus2. But the reality is, once we understand how it fits against different roots, we can choose to use that to accent certain colors or certain sounds. So for example, because we're thinking of this already as a B flat sus2, I'm going to visualize this against a B flat. Okay, so we know that works. By the way, just to reiterate, please be careful with your hands. Some of the stretches can get a little gnarly, but do think about what sounds, what roots work with the chord, or, use your right hand to tap the root, or a keyboard to play the root and then play the chord against that, just so you can hear how it sounds. So how does B sound against the root? B sound against the chord? Not my favorite sound in the world. What about C? Well, we know that'll work because it's an inversion of one of the notes that exist within the chord. It's already an inversion of the chord, but it contextualizes it as more of a sus kind of sound. What about D flat? Get like a major 7/13 kind of sound. What about D? The chord that causes a lot of problems. Minor 7 sharp 5 or minor 7 flat 6, or you can look at it as B flat first inversion. What about this? E flat. Again, a very open sussy kind of sound. What about E? Could be usable in some instances, like a very Ionian voicing. What about F? Now this contextualizes it as like F sus4. What about G flat? That's a cool one. That's major 7 sharp 11. What about G? I'm going to put the G down here. You've got minor 11, minor 7 with the 11. What about A flat? You can think of it as A flat major with 9 and 13, or an F minor in first inversion. What about A in the bass? Little bit of a dissonant rub because you've got that minor 9 interval. It's kind of crunchy, but maybe you could get away with it as an Ionian voicing, especially if it's a little more clustered. Ooh, that's actually going to be really hard to play. The point being is that once you start getting these sounds together, you can start seeing how certain things will fit against a bass note. Now, we started with one chord shape, but how many usable scenarios did we find? Well, we had B flat, C, D flat, so that's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and if you want to count this, actually, yeah, if you attack it really softly, it works. To not call as much attention to the dissonance. So let's say 9 or 10 different shapes or different scenarios you can use that one chord shape with. And that applies to all the inversions of that chord shape as well. If you've looked at the inversions of each chord shape. So you see how broad this can get. Automatically, this expands your chord vocabulary to give you some interesting sounds. And this works extremely well with voicings or clusters that are built up in intervals. But you can apply this to your triads as well. So for example, let's say, I don't know, we'll take a C triad. What will happen if I put different roots in the bass? So we have C, obviously. D flat will give us a diminished major 7. D will give us kind of a sus sound. What about E flat? A little too dissonant for my liking. Probably could use it somewhere. E's an inversion. F gives us an F major 9 kind of sound. Or if you have your melody high enough, you could use it as a minor major 7 kind of sound. G flat or F sharp will give us minor 7 flat 5. Or an altered voicing, you can think of it as that. G, inversion. A flat will give us major 7 sharp 5. A will just give us a minor 7. B flat will give us either, depending on context, dominant 7 in the third inversion, or B flat Lydian. B will give us our inversion of C major 7, and then we're back to C. So you see how this can already, as I said before, expand your vocabulary. It's a lot of work. So what I would recommend to do is, as you're going through this, because it can be a lot to remember, is write down or write the chord shape out in fretboard diagrams or whatever it may be to help you remember and kind of classify these things. Like, okay, this can be a sussy voicing, like a kind of sus2, sus4, and group them together. So I know that if I put F in the bass, or a bass note a fourth down from this shape, I've got sus4, I've got another sus, and another suspended sound. So that's already 4 chords I've got in my arsenal, and I've got them in this general category of suspended chords. What about the major chords? If I'm thinking first inversion, Ionian voicing. That's one of the sus voicings, and so I've got another 4 shapes, and depending on what color I want, then I can access it at any given moment. And then what I would recommend is start putting it into musical contexts where you can easily relate the sound to the chord. I think that's a really important part that a lot of us skip over when it comes to learning chords. We get caught up in the mechanic and not actually really internalizing the sound and being able to access the sound at any given moment. So let's say, I don't know, apply this to a tune or apply this to a progression and force yourself, let's say, if this is going to be your major voicing, let's say the tune starts with an F major 7, visualize the root, and then play the chord on top of it. And if you want to further expand your vocabulary, try see how it relates, how an inversion of that chord can relate to the root as well. So we can put that here, right? Then we can do that. So already just by inverting that chord shape and then putting the root somewhere else, we've learned 3 new major 7 chord shapes. That's 1. 2, that might be a familiar one. That's one we use for major 7-13. And this one. Now imagine how this can be expanded across the instrument to various different chord types. So how does this benefit your trio playing? Well, you see, I'm physically playing the root in a lot of these voicings. When you play in a trio context, or any other context where there's a bass player, you don't want to step on the bass player's toes. You want to give them room to play and to be a bass player. Otherwise, you may as well just be a solo guitar player. So what I'll do is, let's say the bass player is playing a G root, and I want to play around with some minor sounds on top of that. So I might not be playing the root in any of those voicings, but it allows me access to different colors. And especially, let's say, I don't know, if my melody note was this D over here, I could start playing around with different colors and let the bass player take care of the root. So that opens up and gives me more freedom. And sometimes when, if you listen to some of my records, or Catharsis specifically, because that's a good example of a trio record, there are some cases in the chord melody arrangements or the arrangements of the heads for the tunes where I let the bassist cover the root note, and because it would be too difficult for me to play the root note, the voicing, and the melody on top, I let him take care of that, and then I'll take care of the melody and the structure. So it kind of gives the impression that there's a lot more going on than there actually is. Now, as far as solo playing goes, this just gives you a lot more room to breathe and color. Again, I know I'm reiterating this a lot, but really the principle is color and sound in this context. And not just from the perspective of, okay, I can play around with different stuff, but let's say, depending on where the melody may fall and against what chord it falls, I can kind of figure out, okay, maybe this voicing will work. Maybe this voicing will work. Let's say I'm playing a D flat major chord, and I have this A flat as my melody note. Maybe, and let's say, this can apply for solo or trio. Let's say the bass player, or bass player's playing D flat, or if I'm playing solo, I've alluded to D flat already by playing it somewhere. I can then play another chord voicing that maybe doesn't have the root, but contains the melody note. Or let's say just keep it a fourths voicing. Or say I want that. Or maybe I want like a real kind of Lydian sound. Now you see, that would be hard to play. So this is a good example of a solo context where I would maybe imply the root first, and then play the chord afterwards, right? Using the melody note and maybe one of these voicings I've figured out. Now, how would this work? Well, I've determined from exploration that, and also reference from hearing this in other recordings, that E flat over D flat is a really good Lydian sound. So if A flat's my melody note and I can reach that, that's an option. It's something that's available. So I hope this lesson's given you a lot of food for thought and some room to think about things like, okay, how can I use my existing vocabulary and develop it further? Because chances are you may have some more room to do some work with the chords you already know. Therefore, thereby getting a lot more mileage out of this information. And even if it's stuff with your drop twos, you can experiment with that as well. Drop twos, drop threes. Start moving the root about and see what you can figure out. Or if you have a bunch of cluster voicings or voicings that are more intervallic in nature, experiment with how those chords reflect against a different root. And make a little catalog of them and try use them in musical situations to build up your vocabulary and furthermore work on your ears and be able to access these chords at any given moment. So I hope this was helpful for you guys, and I'll see you in the next video.